Oi oi Savaloy, it's your boy Jack Slack. They call me Jackie S, but I run this shit like Jackie O. And it's the Fights Gone By podcast episode 87, coming at you on the 28th of June. And let's be real, there's fuck all going on this weekend. There's a Bellator event, but they're headlining it with a Lima McFarlane whatever. Is, by Tapology at least, ranked at the number 10 women's flyweight in the world. I couldn't give a shit about women's flyweight, but also she will never not be the woman who beat the shit out of the soccer mom at Explode Fighting Championship. And who's backing up that powerhouse main event? Why, it's Ryan Couture, who I didn't even know was still fighting. But he's fighting Sadawad, so he's probably getting sparked. So maybe there'll be a nice highlight from that. But, you know, those are not the caliber of fighters that we're going to be talking about game plans, because you don't care, and if you pretend you are, you're lying. However, there was some interesting news out of Bellator this week, which actually is worth caring about, and I'm not talking about the fact that they allegedly bought a phrase from 50 Cent for $50,000 or something like that, which was "get the strap." Really sounds more like something that Buffalo Bill would say in Silence of the Lambs, but that's neither here nor there. Whatever Scott Coker wants to waste his money on, I will not judge. I'll just be here to laugh. Actually, I will judge. That's half my job. But, you know, we got a lot of interesting news this week and a few high-profile retirements. So we got some stuff to talk about. And I figured, rather than rushing through the news this week, let's savour it. Let's get some content out of it. Because God knows we're going to struggle if we try and do previews. But yeah, I mean, we can preview some of the fights that have been signed, you know, and talk about that. And we'll answer some questions too. And we'll just sort of rap about the state of MMA and the state of Bellator, I suppose, more importantly. But I think we'll start with the UFC retirement, which was, of course, Rashad Evans. Actually, there's two, but we'll start with Rashad Evans, because that was earlier. He announced it on the new MMA Hour. Let's just get into the new MMA Hour first. Allegedly, 1 billion people have seen it, like Elvis in Hawaii. Which was literally impossible at the time. But 1 million people have allegedly viewed it, but that's on the Twitter count, and it autoplays on the feed of everyone who follows ESPN. So it turns out there were actually only about like 6,000 to 9,000 people watching it, which was similar numbers to what Luke Thomas got on his first episode, presenting what was the MMA Hour, or what was Ariel Helwani's MMA Hour. And he did a good job. I made sure to shout out Luke this week and say, well done. Because he strikes a nice middle ground, because, there are people like me who don't do interviews, and there are people like Ariel who don't really do any analysis of the fights. But Luke is doing very well striking a middle ground. And of course, he got a very difficult job because, well, as evidenced by the numbers on our podcasts normally, there's only so many people who really want to get into the nitty-gritty of fights. A lot of people would rather you not be like, well, he could win or he couldn't win. It's, they're very good fighters and this could happen and this could happen. They would rather you just talk to people or they'd like to draw their own conclusions where they go, no way Conor McGregor would ever lose a fight to Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz lost to so-and-so. But that's the state of MMA media. How do we get onto that? Forgive me, I'm just going to ramble today. But on the new MMA, what's it called? The Ariel Helwani MMA showcase. Rashad Evans issued his retirement, and he issued a statement again this week. And it's good. It's good that he's retiring, because you remember before that Anthony Smith, well, before every Rashad Evans fight recently, I've been saying, when's he going to retire? And, I think I started writing a piece about this, and I never actually finished it, but I was just talking about how what's really rewarding, it's nice when a fighter takes less beatings to realise that they're done. You're never going to get a guy leave while he's on top, because they'll always go, well, maybe I've still got it, after they get bored after a few months of retirement. There's a enormous adrenaline rush from fighting, and the highs are very high and the lows are very low, and people will always come. If you've been the champion of the world, you're always going to be able, you're always going to want to come back and say, well, maybe I'm not top 10 at the moment, but I reckon I could take some of these lower down guys pretty easy. And you gradually find out more and more that no, your body's just shagged. You don't have it anymore. On the subject of bodies being shagged. Actually, I don't know if I've used that phrase that often on this podcast, but I use it quite a lot in real life. I say, this is shagged, my knee is shagged. My knee is shagged at the moment, hence the bench press personal record the other week. But yeah, my life, half of my life is just coming into the living room, pointing at a joint to my wife and saying, does this look shagged? And then she'll like poke it and go, I don't know, see a doctor. But we know we've got a fair agreement. I do the same for her. So I love going on like MMA forums and people being like, knee does this when I move. What should I do? Always the top comment is see a doctor, dipshit. But like people are going to say, yeah, just wrap it in cling film and you'll be fine. But returning to Rashad Evans, so it took him a little while to work out that he just doesn't have it anymore. And I think that commission stuff really helped. I mean, when I wrote, 4 PR catastrophes waiting to happen for the UFC, which is a much better article than the title implies, I really enjoyed that one, actually. Did very well. Did mad hits for Vice. But in that, I was talking about the dangers of keeping these old dudes fighting while they're taking KO after KO, and then especially the dangers of commission hopping. Doing things like when Bisping was basically knocked out with a left hook by George St. Pierre and then battered with elbows and then choked unconscious. The choking unconscious, we don't really think that matters that much. We'll probably find out in like 5 years that it gives you brain damage, but at the moment it's the hitting that's the problem. But then 30 days later goes and fights Kelvin Gastelum in Shanghai, because there's no commission there. And that's really shady, and that's the stuff that's going to get people killed, or if someone does, to be fair, it's no more likely to get anyone killed than what's happening just generally in fighting. But that's the safety net. The safety net is we follow all the commission rules so that after something tragic does happen, you just go, well, it couldn't be foreseen. We were doing everything the commission asks. If you get medically suspended by one commission, take them overseas and put them in a fight again while they're under medical suspension, as Bellator has done, or does fairly regularly, and as the UFC has done a couple of times quite recently, you end up... In fact, someone was saying that OSP wanted to fight again. Having, the first part of that Tyson-Pedro fight was him getting his shit kicked in. They were trying to get him to fight again in a month or something like that. And I was just going, that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. He was knocked down. But they started shopping people around to multiple commissions, and that's really shady. And they had to do that with Rashad Evans when the New York Commission found something sketchy on his brain scan, which should tell you something, because how many times have you ever heard of like an MRI or a CAT scan or whatever coming back with worrying results in fighting? We take a picture of Andrei Arlovsky's brain and it looks like Swiss cheese, but we go fine. So then they went to another commission and they turned them down, and the story after that was, well, they only turned him down because New York turned him down. They didn't really turn him down because of his actual condition. But you're getting so fucking shady at that point. So they shopped him around 3 commissions to get him back in the cage. But people are going to focus on after the Glover Teixeira KO in 2016. But by the time he fought John Jones in 2012, well, after that, he was pretty much shot. They gave him Antonio Rogerio Nogueira as a gimme. There is no way that wasn't a gimme, because Antonio Rogerio Nogueira famously sucks against wrestlers. And then Rashad came out and didn't seem to know what to do against a southpaw and just patted his hand for 3 rounds and lost the decision very boringly. So they gave him another gimme against the old Dan Henderson, and he managed to get a split decision win while getting knocked down. And then they gave him Chael Sonnen, who's a middleweight, and he actually managed to finish that one. And that was the last win of his career back in 2013. So you could see that he was pretty much done from then. When has Chael Sonnen ever beaten a bigger wrestler? But the sad ones were the Glover Teixeira KO. Dan Kelly's split decision loss, but it was fun enough to watch Dan Kelly sort of peak Dan Kelly, because he was old, but he was still doing fun stuff. But very sad to see Rashad Evans fall that far. Sam Alvey and Dan Kelly should not be going to split decisions with Rashad Evans, really. And then the Anthony Smith one, knee out of the clinch, and it just looked like he wasn't strong enough and couldn't take the shots anymore. Anthony Smith's a big, strong guy, but getting caught with those little knees out of the clinch and being knocked out by them, very unusual, especially for a wrestler of Rashad's caliber. An MMA wrestler, at least. So the fact that he's retired is pretty good news, and I appreciate that. And he did have some, huge moments in his career. The thing is that he was, transitionary star. You know, he was like a guy who came in through a reality show, you know, through The Ultimate Fighter, as a heavyweight, fighting guys like Brad Imes and Sam Hoger, and ultimately ended up going down to middleweight and looking small there even. But, you know, started out with obviously the very famous knockout of Sean Salmon. But, you know, consider that, and then the step up in competition that he took to fight Tito Ortiz with that draw. Got the decision over a young and still light heavyweight Michael Bisping. And then in 2008, he's thrown in with Chuck Liddell after, you know, not the biggest win of his career. And Chuck was coming off the Quinton Jackson TKO loss and then the Keith Jardine split decision. But he got back on track with that win over Vanderlei Silva, where he really sort of played the points game a bit more. And then he gets in with Rashad, and Rashad circles the ring almost side on in like a horse stance, and then throws this overhand from a day's travel behind him and knocks Chuck out. And that really was like the only example of that sort of thing from Rashad in his entire career. But any time he was fighting, that was the highlight they were using. They were going, he could knock anyone out at any time, and really he couldn't. Like he had that one big punch knockout on his record, and that was about it. But then he fought Forrest Griffin for the title. Forrest Griffin had just won it off Rampage, and if you remember any of that fight, it really just highlighted that Forrest Griffin couldn't hit ever, really. Rashad Evans, who wasn't famous for his chin, even then, just walked through his punches. Which is always like when people show the footage of Anderson Silva ducking and weaving and completely disregarding Forrest, I always feel like there weren't really any consequences if you did fuck up your weaves there. It's just left, right, shoulders well forward of hips. Huge dude, but can't punch for toffee. But the knockout was pretty brutal in that one. Like, he had Griffin's leg. He had his leg stacked up, and he was punching him from between his legs on the ground. It was a really impressive victory. And then he fought Lyoto Machida when Machida was undefeated, and that was the start of the Machida era, obviously. And that was an interesting fight because they thought they were going to play the counter fighter with Machida, and then as soon as he led, he got dropped. The Evans and Thiago Silva fights are what I consider like Lyoto Machida's perfect fights. Very little activity, finds ways to open up when the other guy isn't doing anything and like actually hurt them. And then when they do open up, he's always there with the counter. But then, of course, there was sort of like an intermediary period where, I mean, he beat Thiago Silva, Quinton Jackson, Tito Ortiz, and Phil Davis all back to back. So those were good, relevant guys, and he did deserve that second second go at the title when he fought John Jones. But you'll remember, like, this period of Rashad's career was just made up of beefs that amounted to very little. You know, the Quinton Jackson fight, which really didn't turn out anything like anyone hoped. The knee to the sternum of Tito Ortiz while he was on his knees was fucking awesome, though. Anyway, thank you, Rashad. That was a lovely little career that you wrapped up there, and I'm glad that I don't have to watch you get knocked out anymore, at least until you go to Bellator. And then the other retirement was Johnny Hendricks. Now, Johnny Hendricks, obviously, we can't talk about Johnny Hendricks without talking about the massive drop-off that he had after USADA and the IV ban came in. And the thing with Hendricks is that he lost an awful lot of speed. He used to get across the floor very, very quick. And he wasn't the best striker in the world, but he could go even with good strikers by getting in so fast and hitting really hard. Struggled for a long time to try and like win back the, bring back the old Johnny. That's why you don't try and flush him. He was with a really weird team for a while that were taking like 50% of his earnings in perpetuity or something like that. But he famously overate and didn't train enough, and then every way in there was a different excuse. I'm sorry, guys, I thought these pants weighed nothing, these underpants. It turns out they weigh 2 kilos. He actually explained that. The time that he made weight, he had the explanation and excuse already said to the entire room of media before he got on the scale and surprised himself. But yeah, I mean, he'll always be the guy who beat GSP, or beat GSP up, at least. So good for him in that regard. And the 2 fights that he had with Lawler were phenomenal. His later career really sucked. It was just depressing losses and boring wins. But you can't really complain about his performance in those 2 Lawler fights. So on to the Bellator news, I suppose. Bellator announces Gegard Mousasi versus Rory McDonald. A very interesting choice of fight. Obviously, after all that talk from both the head of ONE FC and Coker about how they do the Rory versus Ben Askren fight, a fight that actually made sense and people cared about. They're now doing Mousasi versus Rory, which people do care about, let's be fair. It's just very clear that they're doing it because they don't have any middleweights. Very strange. I mean, Rory should lose this, but, who knows? Gegard Mousasi is probably the most overrated fighter in the world. In terms of, he is very clearly a top 10 fighter in the middleweight division, and a very talented fighter, and skilled in every area, but he has one win over like a truly elite middleweight, and that was Chris Weidman on a bit of a career slump, and it was a controversial ending, and it was a super competitive fight where he was getting taken down and getting his guard passed up until that point. How everyone wants to redo the Dustin Poirier-Eddie Alvarez fight because they want a more decisive result. But nobody is calling for, Weidman-Gegard Mousasi 2 because the Mousasi fans just want to keep it. They're like, oh, don't run it back. But yeah, he is consistently, people are always like, oh, he's actually the best middleweight in the world, but he just can't beat the top middleweights. But that's what his career is now. He has left the UFC so that he can go and beat the also-rans in Bellator, and then, much like Nick Diaz, people will start to believe that he is actually the number one middleweight in the world, just to be contrarian. But yeah, he should beat Rory. I mean, it's interesting because neither of them are big bangers. Both of them rely heavily on the jab. Both of them strike more comfortably against people who really aren't very good strikers. Rory's a hitter on the ground, but then so is Mousasi. I would probably say that Rory does more damage on the ground generally, but, Mousasi's got a couple of stoppages with the old Habib arm trap and then sit him down on it. I think it's probably going to be similar to... Actually, no, it's not going to be similar to Khalidov versus Narkun, because Khalidov can bang, and was actually winning that fight up until he lost. Yeah, it'll be very interesting, because obviously everyone goes on about how gigantic Rory is as a welterweight, but I don't know if he'll be that big as a middleweight, and a lot of his game is just overpowering dudes. I would like to see him utilise his kicks, though, because his kicks, well, they looked pretty samey against Lawler, but against Tyron Woodley and BJ Penn, they looked very varied and powerful. And Mousasi typically focuses on the boxing. I mean, he does have that win over Kyotaro years ago, but Kyotaro wasn't really a kickboxer. He was more a jog and punch kind of guy. Yeah, I suppose we'll talk about it more when it gets closer, but... Well, I mean, the other big news this week was that they're going to do a welterweight Grand Prix, which is very exciting, actually. As much as it's obvious that Bellator has no middleweight division, and they're making this match to, stall for time, their welterweight division is very, very good. I've been saying this for ages. They've got Larkin. Well, actually, no, they got Lima. They got Koreshkov, guys they had already. They got MVP, who hasn't beat anyone worth a damn. But I'm just wondering how they're gonna avoid putting him in this Grand Prix, because they have done the old bait and switch before. They've done press conference. Announced press conference with MVP and Paul Daly, had them both turn up and said Paul Daly will be fighting Douglas Lima or someone of that caliber, and MVP will be fighting the gentleman who gave you programs on the way in. So don't underestimate it. I mean, it could go one of two. Well, it could go one of three ways. He could fight someone legitimate and win, or lose. But the other two ways that it could go is you have a load of killers in the tournament, but MVP gets, I don't know, who's not great. Maybe they try and make that Derek Anderson fight again. Derek, the lightweight Anderson, in the first round, and then they try and get him another highlight reel stoppage before they use him to sell the fight in the second portion of the tournament. It'll be very, very interesting. I would not be surprised if they just don't put him in, or if he fights some schlub in the first round and then gets injured and pulls out. But there are so many good matchups in that, possible matchups in that tournament. It's a shame Rory's not in, but then I have mixed feelings about champions being in the tournament if the winner fights for the belt. The tournaments are great for deciding a belt if you've got a vacant belt or if you've got a new belt, but if you have the champion in the tournament, it gets complicated. Like when Dan Henderson was Pride's welterweight champion, having won it in a tournament, immediately went into the next tournament and lost to Kazuo Misaki, who won that tournament, but didn't get the belt even though he'd beaten the champion and won the tournament. So, and that's the entire reason that Dan Henderson was quote-unquote simultaneous Pride welterweight and middleweight champion when he beat Vanderlei. He wasn't simultaneous. He hadn't done anything in middleweight for years except lose a fight to Misaki. God, Misaki was good. Bring him in as a surprise entrant, because he had one fight at like proper welterweight, and that was against Paul Daly, and he boxed him up. But the main people that we're thinking about are Paul Daly, Lima, Koreshkov, though Koreshkov has beef with Bellator at the moment because they're not giving him fights. Shlemenko is in the same camp with him as having beef, but he's more fighting at middleweight at the moment, isn't he? I can't remember. If they're desperate, they could get Bendo to go up again, but he's not a welterweight. He's a lightweight with very big thighs. It would be really cool, if they could get ONE FC to sign off on Ben Askren being their representative in the tournament, and then, maybe throw him a softball in the first round just to have a bit of a working relationship with them. I won't hold my breath, but if Ben Askren's in that tournament, you will see Ben Askren against better opposition than he's fought since the last time he was in Bellator. So that's all really cool, actually. Good on you, Bellator. And then otherwise they announced that they'd signed Lyoto Machida. Apparently Machida, they offered Machida a deal. He said okay to the deal, and then the UFC matched the offer, but Machida said, no, I've already given my word to Bellator. Because that's the awesome sort of guy that Machida is. But also, the Machidas have a good relationship with Bellator because of Chinzo. And, Machida's at the stage in his career where he wants easier fights. And who's easier than Gegard Mousasi, eh? Just triggering some Mousasi fans there. No, I mean, I would pick Mousasi over him at this point in his career. And I imagine that's the title fight they'll line up. But, maybe throw Lyoto in with Carvalho and see what he's got left. Or if Carvalho ever really had anything. That could be fun. That could be fun. I was getting pretty sad in the lead up to Vitor versus Lyoto. And even after the knockout, it's got to that stage where when Lyoto wins, it's more just relief for me than it is excitement. Even when it's a cool front kick to the face. Is that everything? Oh, I think that's everything. Well, as I talk, there's developments in that Justin Gaethje Al Iaquinta match. Al Iaquinta is throwing a bitch fit again. Al Iaquinta is absolutely the kind of fighter who bites the hand that feeds. There are fighters who you can totally understand making a massive deal out of everything. But Al Iaquinta has been, for a very long time was fed old men in easy knockouts because they wanted him to succeed. So, he's the kind of guy who's like, everyone's out to get me, but doesn't realise that they've been helping him along the whole while. Even after his first massive fallout with them. Come back, here's Diego Sanchez for you to knock out. Just line up that softball. Nice underarm serve for you. But apparently that fight's fallen through and now James Vick has taken it. There was talk of David Tamer taking it. My main concern is, I saw someone say this actually and I thought it was a really good point, but they said, I don't really want to see Justin Gaethje waste one of his 5 remaining fights on James Vick. Which, kind of makes sense. But I mean, James Vick's a big dude. If he fights smart, and he's a good kicker too, so if he fights smart, he could definitely make this a very hard fight for Gaethje. And if Gaethje fights smart, he'll be the greatest fighter in the world, but he won't fight smart because he's Justin Gaethje. Anyway, that covers that for this week. What happened over the weekend? Oh, we had that Singapore event. I did an article on the Edwards-Cerrone fight because I was really impressed by Leon Edwards. If you watched that fight, someone asked me what sort of star rating I would give it if I was still doing those. And I said probably 3.754 territory because I enjoyed it a lot, but it's probably not top entertainment for other people. An awful lot of it was counter control in the clinch. Cerrone has been doing really well recently, surprising guys with his level change and his wrestling. Because obviously at lightweight he was gigantic, and a level change is very hard to do if you've got half a foot of height on the other guy. He's going to beat you to lowering his hips every time. But he's very good at throwing something, drawing the opponent in, and then shooting underneath, and it works much better at welterweight because the dudes are much closer to his own height. But every time he timed the shot, Edwards would get his head underneath Cerrone's, and he'd either use the whizzer, locking in at the thigh with the overhook, or get the underhooks and then start working. Did good work with his knees, and he used the elbow on the break every single time. Even in round 4 when he got taken down because he was getting tired, He got up and immediately, as he was circling out of the clinch, cracked Cerrone with the elbow. Cerrone's chin looked good in this fight because he was taking a lot of elbows, both on the eye where it had been split open with the knee very early on, and across the chin that turned his head around. And there were multiple points where he wobbled, but he looked fine afterwards, so good on him. I think the case with Donald Cerrone is, he's very proud of not watching tape on anyone else, but also there is a shit ton of tape out there on Cerrone. I've written like 10 articles on Cerrone, which apparently Darren Till read when he was training for Cerrone. But, everyone knows what Donald Cerrone does. Everyone knows that he's got significant shortcomings. And if you actually fight to those, you're going to have a much easier time. It's like Jeremy Stephens. If you butt heads with him, you've got a great chance of getting finished horribly. But if you just go to the same things that have worked for everyone else, and you do them fairly strictly, without making any mistakes, and you have the discipline to stick to the game plan, you're probably going to beat him. Someone pointed out that almost all of Cerrone's losses are against southpaws, which is an interesting stat. I think that's to do with, there's an awful lot of factors at play there. Some of those guys got on him very early, and he's a famously slow starter. Some of them got to his body. He famously has something of a glass body because he had a length of his intestine removed at one point. And a lot of southpaws gravitate towards the straight left anyway. And, whereas orthodox fighters in MMA generally don't have a great straight hitting game unless they're very good strikers. So I think Donald Cerrone has loopy punches and long limbs, and those combine to really be bad against good straight hitters. Straight hitters get boxers plums, as my favourite headline ever goes. Trying to think of other cool stuff from that card. Ovince Prue, as I said, got beaten up by Tyson Pedro and then came back and straight arm locked him with a really like a basic jiu-jitsu, muscling it on some white belt kind of move. It was really cool. I really liked how Pedro was moving in the early going. But good on Ovince Prue. He's tougher than he should be for a man of that size. They're supposed to just sort of give in when they get beat up. Ovince Prue, people constantly being like, oh my god, Ovince Prue's actually beaten a lot of people. Is he starting to put it together now? The thing about Ovince Prue is that he literally cannot put it together. He has thrown more than one strike in a row twice ever, and those were the 1-2s that he hit John Jones with. He never ever throws combinations, very rarely does anything clever on the feet. He has all the athletic potential in the world, and he's a very strong grappler, but he just doesn't do anything clever. It's a really obviously he's training combinations every day in the gym, but he just doesn't do them in fights. Jessica Eye beat Jessica Rose Clark. Li Jianliang beat Daichi Abe. I thought he looked really good, lots of low kicks, lots of power. Abe had a ridiculous chin. Oh, and Li Jianliang gets to main card while the guy that he just lost to and I gouged the shit out of, Jake Matthews, is fighting on the prelims. Matthews against Shinso Anzai. I said this on Twitter, but that looked like a world-class welterweight versus not that. He just manhandled him and beat him senseless. What else was good? Xiaonan Yan, or Yan Xiaonan, whichever you prefer, versus Vivian Pereira. Vivian Pereira never did anything different, just kept getting jabbed in the face and not showing any urgency. Yan Xiaonan, I like the hook kick she came out with. I like her jab. I hate her right hand. She stops, sticks her head up in the air, leans well forward, throws the right hand, normally doesn't hit with any power or, land a good connection, and is there for a counter. Fortunately, Pereira was, 6 inches shorter than her and not very good at striking. Oh, Song Yadong was fun. And the guy he just beat retired, which I thought, when I saw that, I was like, yeah, he did look more like a jiu-jitsu player in the cage rather than an actual fighter. There were moments where he very much looked like he didn't want to be there. But yeah, that's about it. Not a tremendous night of fights because it wasn't a very important card and it's in the middle of the World Cup. Not much going on this weekend, so what we'll do is we'll do a couple of questions and then we'll get the fuck out of here. Hey Jacare Slackare, the alligator of the MMA reporting scene. After Cerrone's performance against Edwards, what would you say he could add to his game at such a late stage in his career? Personally, I think he could do a guest camp at Ray Longo. Jim? Is that supposed to be Sarah Longo? I don't know, it's got a hyphen. To rehone his distance and countering skills with a fresh gym with top strikers. Thanks from Connor. Brackets, not McGregor. Oh, he's ruined my favourite joke. I think the thing is that Cerrone's too stuck in his ways. You know, the thing about having all those fights is that he's had all those fights where he's cemented those habits that he's got. The straight hitting isn't going to sort itself out. He was doing better when he was using his footwork more and alleviating pressure that way. The use of the intercepting knee was really troubling dudes, but he hasn't hit that nearly so often at welterweight. I think welterweight hasn't actually been the best move for him because the dudes hit harder and he doesn't have that massive reach and height advantage that was protecting him to a degree in the lower weight classes. The other thing that was really noticeable about against Edwards and Till is that he does just run in on a straight line. When he's run out of ideas, he just goes like, you know, that jab straight to the body, come up with the punch, and then the high kick or some shit like that. Like the Rick Story. It works if they stand there and take it, or, if they back straight up. But if they take a step off to the side at all, like Edwards and Till did, you just run straight past and you open yourself up for counters. I think, boxing and footwork would be a great addition for him, but he's happy doing what he's doing. Sorry, Connor. Then be the facts. To our boy, the Luke Rockhold of My Neighbour's Cuckold, the Randy Couture of MILF and Mature, and the Michael Bisping of Anal Fisting. That is a grotesque opening line, sir. The pound-for-pound rankings seem to have caused a lot of debate with fighters and fans alike, and in recent weeks, even you, our boy Mr. Slack, showed your disbelief that Bobby Knuckles could be ranked so low. The truth is, pound-for-pound rankings are as realistic as fantasy sports leagues, and as pointless as and unmeasurable as comparing who the greatest fighter of all time is. However, there is one ranking system that can, if required, be truly tested, and it is the one that the whole reason that the UFC exists. The Ultimate Fighter. The original UFCs were held to find the baddest man on the planet, and so such a ranking system ought to exist, especially over the divisive pound-for-pound rankings. The ranking method would be straightforward. The heavyweight champ is generally considered the baddest man, and should therefore be ranked number one. By default, the next baddest man would be the number one ranked contender at heavyweight. In this case, currently Francis Ngannou. However, I would need to check if the light heavyweight champion (brackets DC) could be considered to be badder than the number one heavyweight contender Ngannou. If so, you could consider whether DC is, in this case, would be able to beat Stipe, and so on. A very quick example based on UFC's current rankings would be DC, Stipe, Gustafsson, Curtis Blades, Alex Volkov, Overeem, Bobby Knuckles, Yoel Romero, Derek Lewis, Rockhold. All very relevant and topical with the upcoming Stipe versus DC clash, don't you think? Along with Curtis Blades so high up the list. Maybe I've just wasted my time writing this. Cheers and keep up the excellent work, Savaloy Joe. Yeah, okay. This is what I'm always talking about when I say people are trying to moneyball fighting. You can't moneyball fighting. But this was a good laugh, actually. I had fun reading this one. But like, DC, Stipe, Gustafsson. Fucking Gustafsson. What's he done in like the last 3 years? He keeps talking about like how he's going to fight on the upcoming card, but he can't get an opponent. And you're just like, okay, cool. So we're going to see you fight another last minute jobber. What's the fucking point of that? Sorry, enough of a Gustafsson rant, but the baddest man on the planet, I just hate that since they started doing it with Cain Velasquez or Brock Lesnar or whoever it was. It was just like, it worked as a nickname for Mike Tyson, but when you arbitrarily assign it to anyone, nobody was like, oh, Lennox Lewis, baddest man on the planet. They were like, Lennox Lewis, master boxer, beat the shit out of Mike Tyson. But, the baddest man on the planet, it tends to, I don't know, maybe you could have Ngannou, but Ngannou has fought almost nobody good and lost to the really good guy that he did fight. Except two chinny old men. But, it's talking about heavyweight just depresses you because you put Bobby Knuckles in that list, but almost every heavyweight would just sit on him. Size makes a ton of difference in fighting, which is why it's the whole open weight class and all that stuff doesn't really work because big guys fight like shit and the biggest guys tend to beat the smaller guys who fight good. But there are diminishing returns because, people go, oh, well, the flyweights must be the most technical division because they are the smallest. And then you go, well, have you actually ever watched a flyweight fight? Anyone who actually considers Demetrius Johnson pound for pound number one tends to be the kind of person who talks about flyweight fights but doesn't actually watch them. Awful lot of one-dimensional fighters down there who wouldn't hold up in any other division, or certainly wouldn't get a title shot. But anyway, yeah, when people talk about like open weight stuff too, heavyweight is open weight. There are no people who can't make 265 except Bob Sapp, and we're not missing out on Bob Sapp. The whole thing is that like guys are free to go up and fight at heavyweight. If Frankie Edgar wanted to take a heavyweight fight, he could. The thing is, it's dumb because the bigger guy will crush him. I just think of this whenever someone's like, oh, I wish the UFC, or I missed the open weight Grand Prix of Pride. And you're like, well, you know, you could have an open weight series of fights in the UFC. It wouldn't make any difference, you know. The Grand Prix I do miss, but the open weight stuff, just like, why? Why do that when you can just have everyone talk about how they might move up and then never actually do it? Anyway, yeah, baddest man rankings are every bit as bad as pound for pound. I'm sorry, Savaloy Joe. Cheers. Greetings, Jack. Have you ever read any combat sports manga? Karate Shikush... Fuck. It's been a long time since I went to Japan. It's been a long time since I spoke any Japanese, and my Japanese is dog shit, but here we go. Karate Shikushe Kohinata Minoru might interest you. I did that in the voice of the King of the Cosmos from Katamari Damacy. It was fierce and striking, like a pompadour. Back to the question. It follows the tale of a college student who joins a karate club and starts working his way through tournaments and eventually enters professional kickboxing. It's pretty realistic in regards to the different schools of karate and the behind the scenes in kickboxing promotions. Minor spoiler, but the leading promotion in the manga is based on K1 and the owner is shown to be pretty shady. It and Hajime no Ippo, there we go, I know Hajime no Ippo, another famous combat sports manga, got me into combat sports, and seeing Tenshin Nasukawa reminded me of the protagonist, who is also a young Japanese pretty boy karateka with a thing... Is this a yaoi? Is that what a yaoi is? Is also a young Japanese pretty boy karateka with a thing for the rolling thunder kick. Do you mean the time-wasting kick? I understand that you're a busy man, but if you've got time, you should check it out, Mohammed. I'm not that busy. I actually will check it out. It sounds fun. Hajime no Ippo, I watched the anime and I really enjoyed it. What I really like about it is that anytime something important happens, everything stops and there's like 40 seconds of just, oh, he's going to hit me with the uppercut. And the theme music was always fucking brilliant. What were they called? Something Lemon. Shocking Lemon. Actually, folks heard that I was reading Junji Ito the other week. I bought a load of Junji Ito. I started with Go, which was shit. Like, there's no real ending, and the story's shit. It's just like a bad B movie. But in the back of it, they had the Enigma of Amigara Fault, which is a terrific, creepy comic short. But I've moved on to what's called Uzumaki, the one about the spirals, which is actually pretty creepy. But if you have any weird manga recommendations, I'm getting into that whole medium now. Not in like a hardcore weeby way, but just in a like, oh, this is interesting. And I have always, very much enjoyed things like Studio Ghibli. So it's nice to get into like the book format. But yeah, if you have any of those, suggest them to me in the comments or send me another email about them. Right, I've eked out an episode when nothing's going on, so I think we'll call it quits there. If you want to support the podcast and enable me to do these each week, or sometimes 2 times a week when there's a good event and another good event the next week, or you want to listen to the history episodes, the most recent one about Barney Ross was really good fun. Barney Ross, champion, hero, junkie. Someone was offended by that, but junkie is what he called himself. He was very open about drug addiction, and he was one of the very few people at the time who was writing or talking about the addict as a victim rather than a criminal. And his story, like, it's one about suicidal depression and painkiller addiction, and with what's going on in the world at the moment regarding painkiller addiction and the recent celebrity suicides. I was just putting this episode together. It was the same week that Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain both killed themselves, and yeah, I was putting this episode together, and I was just thinking, this is really like not a lot has changed. All this stuff is still happening, but it's so much more okay to talk about now. Yeah, getting dark there. Sorry, yeah, but it's a really interesting subject, and only half of it's like his in-ring stuff. He was a fantastic character. So much stuff happened after he quit the ring. So get in on the Patreon if you want to hear that. If you want to buy Notorious, I think the new copy version of it is coming out soon. If you want to see what I'm up to, I've written a couple of articles this week. Check out thefightprimer.com. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. and I'll catch you next week, and then things will start picking up towards UFC 226. Yes. Conor bless.